The first artwork we're going to look at from ancient Egypt is the Palette of Narmer. And it was found in 1897 by a British archaeologist in the Temple of Horus. It has survived in almost perfect condition. It is a slab of mudstone, which is kind of like a shale. It's not as hard like limestone. It's about 25 inches tall, and it dates from about 3000 to 2920 BCE, during the early dynastic period. The palette is carved in low relief on both sides, and so here it kind of looks like we're looking at two palettes. We're actually only looking at one, the front and the back. So it's carved on both sides with seams that have identifying inscriptions. The palette is a flat stone with a circular depression on one side. And so you can see right here is where that circular depression is. Usually palettes are used for the grinding of eye paint. So in ancient Egypt, both men and women painted their eyelids to help prevent infections of the eye and to reduce the sun's glare. So in modern movies, when we see like Cleopatra or that Scorpion King Mummy movie series, we always see that ancient Egyptians seem to be wearing a lot of eye makeup. And indeed, actually, they would have. The concept to prevent infections of the eye and reduce the sun's glare is similar to what modern-day football players do. They have that paint under their eyes. It's the same kind of concept there. But for Egyptians, of course, it was also aesthetic as well. Now, this particular palette is a little bit unusual because it is so large and so heavy. Remember, it's 25 inches tall. It's made out of slate, so it is actually pretty heavy. I'm sorry, it's made out of shale, so it's actually pretty heavy. Usually they would have been handheld, really the size they would have been, because you're using them to apply makeup onto your face. It wouldn't be practical to hold this giant one as you're putting makeup on your face. So we are led to believe, due to the size and the heaviness, that this is a ceremonial piece. Perhaps this was made as an offering or used to apply makeup to a pharaoh in ritual. Perhaps it was used in a temple. One theory is that it was used to grind cosmetics to adorn the statues of the gods. Remember how I said that the priests would dress and feed the statues in the temple? They, of course, would also put makeup on these statues as well, the statues of the gods. So it could have been used for that as well. In any case, it was probably used in ritual or for something important like that. Now, the scenes that are depicted on this palette depict sort of the foundation of the dynasties of Egypt. So about 3500 BCE, Egypt evolves into several larger states or chiefdoms. And this begins in the lower Nile Valley. About 3100 BCE, Egypt is united under the legendary first pharaoh of Egypt. His name is Narmer. Now this palette is meant to commemorate the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt is in the north. It actually goes with the flow of the Nile, which flows south to north. Narmer is involved on this palette. He's depicted as the main character in various scenes. Now just looking here, you can immediately identify which one is Narmer because of the use of the hieratic scale. So here is Narmer on, we'll call it the front, it's not necessarily the front, but here is Narmer bigger than everybody else. And even when we go over to this side, again, we can tell which one is Narmer because he is still bigger than everyone else. So Narmer is depicted in the hieratic scale. He wears, we're going to talk about this side first. Here on this side, he is wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. From his waist hangs a ceremonial bull's tail. So you can see that right here, hanging from his waist. The bull's tail, of course, is a representation of strength. It's sort of like embodying the powers of that animal. He is holding a mace, which he is prepared to swing. He's holding it up as if he's going to swing it at this guy right here, who has been interpreted as his enemy, probably the leader of Lower Egypt. As you can see in this image, there's hieroglyphs right here, and that could possibly be the name of this guy's region. So back to looking at Narmer. So he's standing in this what has been called the smiting pose, and it actually is a common pose for pharaohs who the next 3,000 years, this mace pose where they're holding a mace about to knock somebody's head out. We'll see that actually later when you look at the Temple of Ramses. So anyway, back to looking at Narmer. So he's holding this mace and he's swinging at his enemy. He's also standing barefoot, and his sandals are held by an attendant behind him, this guy right here. I just brought this image. Obviously, it's not painted this way. This is just to kind of help the imagery pop out so we can see it a little bit better. So his sandals are being held by his attendant. Now, this suggests that Narmer is standing on holy ground. A lot of times, very often, pharaohs are depicted without wearing shoes. And the fact that there's a sandal bearer behind him sort of emphasizes the point that the pharaoh is standing on this holy ground, which you would not wear shoes when you're standing on holy ground. And of course, this is a privilege of the pharaoh himself. So Horus in his falcon form is over here. And he is in his falcon form, but he has a human hand right here instead of a talon. He holds a rope that is tied around this, I guess we'll call him a man, definitely a human head, a man's head here. It's tied around his neck. And out of this man's weird-like body, we have the papyrus plant. A papyrus grows along the Nile River, and it is symbolic for Narmer's control / conquering of Lower Egypt. Underneath this main scene here, we have these two guys right here. These are supposed to be two dead enemies. They are probably personifications of cities, so it's like these two guys, one is meant to represent one city and the other one is meant to represent another city. So that's probably what they're standing for. And this symbol right here represents a walled city. At the top we have what looks like a cow, because that's basically what it is. It's actually the goddess Bat, or Hathor. You see we have two images of her there. She is the protective goddess, and she flanks Narmer's name in hieroglyphs. So here is Narmer's name right here. That's actually how we know who he is, because his name is represented there in hieroglyphs. It is a fish above a chisel, which means the name Narmer. And here we have a close-up of it so you can actually see it a little bit better. Here is the hieroglyphs here, and here is Bat or Hathor. Hieroglyphs actually appear several times throughout this palette. So here are some here, here, over here, again here. This is actually hieroglyphs here, and so is this as well. So hieroglyphs is a system of writing that Egyptians used, and it is picture writing. It's words and ideas rendered in the form of pictorial symbols. The Palette of Narmer is one of the earliest examples of hieroglyphs ever found. And it is the oldest work of art that names a person by name. So before we were talking about the Near East, when we talk about Naram-Sin, we know his name from history. It actually does not have his name on it. So this is actually the first work of art that identifies the person by name. So on the other side of the palette, we have Narmer again. Again, he is the largest person on the composition. And he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. This represents that he rules both lands. His name appears again next to his head, and that sandal bearer marches behind him, still holding his sandals. So he is right here. In front of Narmer, there are 4 men carrying standards right here. Some people identify them as priests, some as soldiers. And they carry standards which represent different regions of Egypt. Over here we have that same hieroglyph that represents a fortified city. So in front of these guys here, there are 2 rows of decapitated and apparently castrated men. So these are Narmer's dead enemies, which have been castrated and decapitated, and their parts have been placed between their feet. You can kind of see them if you look really closely. Here's a close-up of it. Maybe you can see that a little bit better. Above them is a boat with a swallow and an open door. So right here, it's kind of hard to see, but there's some hieroglyphs there as well, over here. We're actually not sure what that means, but obviously it had some sort of important meaning. Now, this part over here is a scene of death. I mean, this is decapitated, castrated men. It's not a happy scene. So when you depict battle, you would think that it would be very chaotic, very, just disorganized. And instead here, on this palette, we see a sense of order, even with the alignment of these dead bodies. They are represented in 2 rows. Now, they are stacked vertically to show depth, so we're not getting a sense of perspective here. Instead, we're seeing them kind of awkwardly stacked so that we can see the most iconic parts of the body. And as you can see with ancient Egypt, they do tend to have a conventional way of depicting the human form, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, in the central register over here, we have the feline creatures with elongated necks on leashes. Now, their necks intertwine, and this represents the union of the 2 parts of Egypt. We also have them there on leashes. You can see they're being controlled by these men here, probably priests. And this represents control, stability, the fact that these wild animals are being tamed. Between their necks, we have that indentation, which would be where the makeup would be mixed. Remember, this is a palette. At the very bottom, we have a bull, and he is watching a foe, so this guy right here. And again, the bull is meant to represent strength, virility, and he's also associated with the pharaoh. So it may actually be an embodiment of the pharaoh. It's representing maybe the pharaoh knocking down a walled city here. So this could be a representation of a walled city or just a city, and this is like a metaphor for the pharaoh knocking it down. Here's a great image that just shows you like some context of how big it actually is. So you can see it's not handheld. You couldn't really use it to actually put on your makeup every day. The scenes on this palette promote Narmer as a great unifier, as a protector, and as a leader of the Egyptian people. It also shows his absolute power and rule over the entire Egypt. The palette of Narmer establishes the regal standard of how a pharaoh should be depicted, as being very strong, larger than life, athletic, idealized in the stiff stance with bare feet, wearing a very similar costume, and also often in this smiting pose. So that's pretty common as well. So it establishes a regal standard which will be followed for thousands of years. And this shows permanence because they don't really change how a ruler is going to be depicted very much. It shows Egypt as unchanging, as strong, as powerful, as unyielding. Now, permanence will become a big theme in Egyptian art. We'll see a lot of large, imposing statues and architecture made of stone. Egypt is a dry environment, and its air preserves much of what would decay in other climates. This gives the Egyptians a sense of permanence. They often feel like the past is never really far from the present because it's right there. There's that pyramid that was built 2,000 years ago. It's still there. So the past is never far from the present. Okay, so the summary of this piece is that it was probably used to apply ritual makeup. It's probably used in ritual. It established a regal standard, and it commemorates the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And it is the first time that we see someone named in a piece of art.